Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
Hello everybody, we are back from Christmas and this is the first podcast of 2024, so welcome, thank you for joining us. Now I don't know about you, but January is always a funny month where I'm always trying to figure out what on earth the year ahead has in store. And so with that very question, today we're joined by Sam Lichtenstein from RANE and we're going to discuss their global forecast for the year ahead. From what I've read of the forecast, 2024 looks like it will be the most influential year that will set the tone for the rest of this decade. So pour yourself a drink, join us for this discussion, and find out what to keep an eye on for the year ahead. I hope you find this episode interesting. Thank you for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
Sam, welcome back to the podcast. How are you?
Thanks, Chris. It's great to be here at the start of 2024.
Yeah, it was great to have you back on. So for the benefit of listeners who may not have listened to our episode last year, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your work at RANE?
Sure. So I am one of the two directors of analysis at RANE, which stands for Risk Assistance Network and Exchange. We're a US-based risk intelligence company with a global outlook. So we cover the entire globe, and our basic work is to not only tell people what's going on, but crucially forecast why it's going to matter in the future. And so we're very well known for our annual forecasts. And then in addition, we do 3 quarterly updates throughout the year for Q2, 3, and 4. So it's a long-standing tradition that we have, and it really drives our entire analytic program for the entire year.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, these forecasts are brilliant. The one we had last year was really great, really interesting, and quite a lot of things that were talked about became hot points. In fact, I was just reflecting on the Middle East section, and in the report, you mentioned that obviously there was a risk of an uptake of violence in Israel, Gaza, and unfortunately that happened. So you guys were definitely sort of on the money with that. So this particular report this year, I mean, it looks like 2024 is going to be a very important year that will probably set the tone for the rest of the decade. And before we go into the specifics of the report, could you just tell us a little bit about how these annual geopolitical forecasts are actually put together?
Yeah, of course. It's simultaneously the most rewarding thing that we do. It is also by far the hardest thing that we do because, of course, writing any piece of intelligence analysis where you're trying to make a forecast is difficult because you're inherently operating in a world of uncertainty, limited information, etc. But now try doing this for the entire globe and for over the course of a full year, if not a little bit beyond at times, and it becomes really, really hard. So thankfully, we do have a well-established way that we do this, and it starts as with a lot of good ideas with just simple brainstorming among our team beginning at least a month before the end of the year, where all of our analysts, not only in their kind of regional groupings but across our regional divisions, are talking to each other. What's the outlook? Sometimes there are very obvious events, so elections, for instance, that gives us a very clear trigger to look at. But sometimes we are looking at larger trends that don't have clear touch points. And so we're looking at kind of the background drivers and constraints on these things. And then through a number of meetings with our entire analyst team and other members of the company, we'll put together our list of basic top lines, and then we'll flesh out using the same analytic tradecraft that we do for all of our work, which is basically focusing much more on the outlook and the implications. We're not trying to tell people what is going on. We are fundamentally making a forecast telling them what we expect to happen, and then crucially, what we expect the impacts of that to be, because a forecast is not useful if you just tell folks, okay, well, this is what we are kind of making a call of what we expect, but we actually want to get to the final point of why does it matter to people? What are the actual implications that we're looking at in terms of economic relations or security dynamics or political stability, et cetera?
Yeah. It's not about trying to be Nostradamus, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little more involved than just flipping a heads or tails coin, but sometimes we do have very heated debates among our team, and we end up always finding kind of a compromise on some of the more contentious issues that hopefully provides value, but still can be kind of within the agreed upon by all members of the team.
It's unfortunate it happens around obviously you've got the kind of deadlines coming up in December, which is around the holidays. I can only assume you're an analyst at RANE that over the holidays you're just hoping nothing significant happens that will change everything.
You've got it exactly right, Chris. It's always a tough time because in addition to it being the holiday season where people are out of the office, spending time with their families. We, of course, try to give our team a well-deserved break. They're also, exactly as you said, hoping, okay, I really hope that this thing that we've been forecasting doesn't change in the next few days. And I will admit there are some times that at the proverbial 11th hour, we email our graphics and production team and say, okay, we need to change a word here or insert a phrase there. I don't think that in my recent memory, though, we've had to make a really analytic, substantive change because the good news is if we've done our work well, then anything that we forecast should incorporate what could happen in kind of the final days of the year. And so there may be some changes around the margin, but I can definitely say this year there were no last minute major reshuffles. And hopefully now with the forecast being out for a few days, we won't have to make any significant updates for Q2 because most of our forecasting for at least the first quarter of the year will be spot on.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, the very big question, can you give us a sort of overview summary of what to expect in 2024?
Yeah, this is a media narrative that we've seen, and I like to think that we were internally discussing this long before the slew of media articles came out in the past week. But fundamentally, this is a year of elections. I believe 7 out of the 10 most populous countries are going to be holding elections. We're talking about billions of people going to the polls, and it's actually even more if you include not just national elections, but supranational elections like for the European Parliament, and then municipal, local elections in a number of countries. But even if we're just looking at the national elections, that's what's going to define the year. Now, obviously, these take place in very different contexts. For instance, Russia will hold a presidential election, if you can call it an election, in the first quarter.
Yeah, I think we know the outcome already.
I will say that's one of the easier calls to make. Spoiler alert, President Putin will win re-election. But then, of course, there are a lot more contentious ones. In our home country, the United States, everyone is, holding its breath already, even though the vote won't be for a number of months now. And then, of course, across the world, you have everyone from the UK, which it seems like it's likely to hold an election in the second half of the year, to countries like Mexico, Indonesia, South Africa, and those elections are going to have huge implications, whether the victory goes to an opposition party, whether the current government retains power. There are going to be a whole host of global things to be on everyone's radar because of those. And so if we were talking about kind of a theme for 2024, I would really say it's driven by those elections.
Yeah, indeed. And one thing that's quite interesting in the report is you talk a bit about the consequences of if President Biden wins re-election or whether Trump wins the election and becomes president again. I don't know if there's anything you want to sort of talk about, some of the differences between the two and how that can affect sort of the geopolitical outlooks. They both have quite different philosophies.
Yeah, to say the least. And this is actually something we debated on a bit with our team because we didn't know how much to talk about this in our 2024 forecast, because obviously any implications of this won't be seen until 2025, even if President Trump were to win a second term. He, of course, wouldn't take office until January 2025. So the impacts won't be felt for another year. But we felt it was important to include this as a really key driver because even though the election won't happen until November, countries across the globe are already preparing. And I can tell you that we've already, even at the end of 2023, started receiving a number of client inquiries about ways in which U.S. policy and therefore global events could shift depending on whether Biden or Trump wins the vote. And so, when you look across the board, there are obviously a huge number of differences. So we can start with some of the proverbial easier ones. For instance, on climate and the environment, President Biden has made, even though he admittedly has opened up a lot more oil drilling, et cetera, he's made environmental policy a key differentiator with the Trump administration. I think it's safe to say that if President Trump were to win re-election, you'd see the United States probably re-exit the Paris Agreement. There'd be even more drilling for oil and gas, that we would see big reductions in climate ambitions. And that's important not only because the United States is obviously the second largest emitter after China, but because, of course, what the United States does will also set the tone for a lot of other countries. And when you have the Biden administration, that's at least pressuring countries like China, like India, other big emitters to up their climate ambition, that's one thing. But if you have a Trump White House that basically says we're going to proverbial drill, baby, drill, obviously, China, India, other emitters feel no pressure to curb their own emissions. So this is a policy with massive global implications because you just need to read the news basically any day to see new dire warnings that the world is heading in the wrong trajectory in combating climate change. And so that's one key differentiator between the two of them. If we're also thinking about global conflicts, obviously Ukraine comes up top of mind. The Biden administration has made strong support for Ukraine a key differentiator with the Trump administration, and another Trump White House, I think it's safe to say, that would definitely decrease support for Kiev. We've already seen Republicans in Congress hold up more U.S. support for Ukraine over border security issues. And return of the Trump administration, which was already, to put it diplomatically, different in its policy towards Russia, would absolutely see the United States decrease support. And that, of course, matters a big deal because if the United States is decreasing support, that also is going to have big implications for Europe's support, which would also presumably then face complications. And this is something we know Vladimir Putin is just kind of waiting for in Moscow and biding his time, knowing that time is kind of on his side, especially if Trump wins. And obviously, a massive decrease in Western support for Ukraine would have global ramifications, not only for security in Europe and Eurasia, but what that means for other conflicts and countries that are considering, their own challenges. There are some things, though, that I think are worth pointing out that are probably going to be similar. And the chief one that I'd highlight here is China policy. Trump in his first administration made very aggressive noises about going after China for all host of issues. And the Biden administration, while they may rhetorically sound a bit different, if you read the policy papers that come out of, say, the Department of Defense, the White House, they're strikingly similar in the way they frame China as a very strategic, the largest threat to U.S. security. And so we expect there would actually be a great deal of continuity, but what might change is kind of the focus. So for instance, the Biden administration has really emphasized technology restrictions and trying to curb China's access to high tech, everything from, semiconductors across the board to communications, artificial intelligence, et cetera. The Trump administration, as Trump famously called himself, or perhaps infamously called himself, tariff man, really makes U.S. trade policy the focus of its, focus on China. And so you'll likely see the same kind of aggressive counter-China policies, but more with an emphasis on hiking tariffs against China specifically, and then, to be honest, across the globe, because Trump has basically insinuated that we should all be preparing for a global trade war with the U.S. Erecting reciprocal tariffs basically on any country that has them against the United States. So China policy is one area where you're likely to see some continuity, even if the focus from, say, high-tech restrictions goes a bit more towards the tariffs. Obviously, there are a whole lot of things that we could talk about here, but I don't want to belabor us just on the United States. Despite me being an American, I'm well aware that our country is not the only one that matters, and there's a whole lot going across the globe in 2024 that I want to make sure we can chat through.
Oh yes, definitely. One last thing just before we move on to the separate regions. Obviously, growing concerns about AI is a bit of a theme of this year coming ahead. I don't know if you have any sort of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the emergence of ChatGPT in November 2022, to say say it was a game changer would be an understatement. We are truly in the infancy of the AI revolution. I think, honestly, anyone that has a strong forecast knowing and predicting where we're going to end up, even in a year, let alone 5 years, probably doesn't know what they're talking about because there's so much uncertainty. The pace of change here is incredible. What we are definitely likely to see, though, in 2024 is that the kind of race and differing perspectives to regulate AI are going to ramp up. Obviously, a few weeks ago, the European Union became really the first jurisdiction with its new AI Act to incorporate kind of a regulatory framework. The EU is, of course, very well known for doing all these sorts of frameworks. It instantly drew a lot of comparisons to the GDPR data regulation. And so what you're likely to see in 2024 is more of the kind of shifting poles among different global areas of power. So the European Union has very much kind of a harm prevention framework that it's now following. The United States, perhaps unsurprisingly compared to Europe on many things, is a little more free market, so to speak, and emphasizing really the development of the tech industry. We're unlikely to see any sort of national regulation in the United States. That means kind of states on their own will become more responsible for what to do. And then you have other global powers like China, India, Russia that are all taking varying approaches. And so we're much more likely to see a divergence here in global tech regulation than anything approaching kind of continuity and unity.
Cool. Thank you for that. So let's talk about the different regions in the report then. Last year, we finished our conversation on sub-Saharan Africa that was, in your words, sort of pretty much one of the most important regions to keep an eye out for in 2023. So I was wondering if we could start with sub-Saharan Africa and kind of talk about what to look out for in the year ahead.
Sure. So sub-Saharan Africa is a great place to start because if we're talking about global elections that are probably flying under the radar a bit, we have a momentous one here. And this is actually how we lead off our section, which is in South Africa. The African National Congress, which has been in power since the end of apartheid, is facing its kind of biggest crisis since then. There's a real risk that it actually may lose its parliamentary majority in the elections that are going to be taking place midway through the year, likely. We put in our report that we forecast that they will be able to probably hold on to a very, very slim majority, but there's a real risk that we outline of various different ways that this could go, in which either they, for instance, lose their majority but retain a plurality and are able to cooperate with other parties, to the least likely but most impactful scenario in which they would actually lose their majority to some sort of opposition group, probably the Democratic Alliance. We don't see that as likely, but what's important here is that the ANC has a huge legitimacy problem. The economy is in shambles, massive, problems with the electricity industry, facing huge surge in crime. I mean, the list is tragically long. And for obviously the region's chief economy there, this is an election to watch, and definitely one that's going to have ramifications far beyond just the country itself.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a sort of growing concern of jihadist terrorist groups in the region as well. So there's anything you want to sort of say on that?
Yeah, this is tragically becoming much more of a regional story. I think this is probably where we ended off last year with us discussing how jihadist groups are basically poised to just continue their slow and steady expansion across the region. And that's exactly what we saw in 2023. And that's tragically what we're forecasting for 2024. Basically, we now have a wide zone of instability across the Sahel, Mali and Burkina Faso in particular, but increasingly seeing places in like Niger, and then slowly creeping down to kind of these literal West African states, so Benin, Ghana, etc. And if you kind of just look at a map and plot on the map over the past few years, kind of this geographic space of attacks, you see not only the numbers increasing, but the geographic breadth expanding. And that's obviously a huge threat because you're now in a region of the Sahel where you have growing jihadist influence. And by the way, growing influence from a number of other armed actors that aren't explicitly jihadist groups, but a whole wide swath of militant rebel groups. You've obviously had numerous coups in the region. Some countries have now seen multiple in the span of a few years. You have French and Western Western forces that are being basically summarily kicked out of virtually all of these countries. And you have the United States that's now on the back foot. Even just yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that the U.S. was now basically looking at drone bases in literal West African states, with the implication being that it kind of had given up on Niger, which is its last main drone base in the region after the coup there earlier in 2023. So this is obviously a huge problem, chiefly, of course, for the people there, because, these groups, whether they're jihadist or not, I mean, just the scale of humanitarian tragedy and violence is appalling. But of course, it also has larger global ramifications. Groups that may be focused on local issues tend to not always stay that way. They generally expand their, goals beyond just the immediate region that they're operating in. And then, of course, what we've also seen is that as these groups are expanding, it's opened up opportunities for Russia to insert its own influence there. And, tragically for these countries, whose governments basically say, oh, well, the French or the UN, they aren't helping protect us. We're going to bring in the Russian paramilitaries. Well, the tragic news is every single time that happens, things only get worse because, unsurprisingly, when you have Russian paramilitary groups that are operating here, that are perpetuating more abuses, that are not focused on protecting civilians, but more about protecting kind of the coup leaders of these countries, et cetera, it's a recipe for just a worsening situation. But it does also give Russia a way to exert its influence, particularly against France as the former colonial power. And that obviously has global ramifications kind of just beyond the main region that we're talking about.
No, indeed. So one to keep an eye on, definitely. Let's move on to the Middle East and North Africa. Can you talk to us about sort of what to expect in those regions?
Yeah, so perhaps unsurprising, the Middle East is going to be a focus. We decided, you spoke earlier about having to make a last minute change, and thankfully, we didn't have to make a last minute change, but based on our fourth quarter forecast, which came out just before the Hamas-Israel war broke out, the focus of our annual forecast changed dramatically from what we originally envisioned it being. And so let me start, obviously, with the Israel-Hamas war because it's top of mind for everyone. What we expect is that the intensity of the war is going to decline earlier in 2024. Even, last week we saw Israel say that it was going to start removing some troops from Gaza. To put bluntly, there's only so much more fighting that Israel can do in the territory. It's very, very small. There's only so many more Hamas militants that it can kill, given its current campaign. And so at some point, we expect in early 2024 that the fighting will decline. But to be very clear, the fighting will not end. Instead, what we're expecting is kind of the inevitable emergence of a Hamas-led insurgency in the Strip. Israel, has been completely unable to find a civilian partner that's willing and able to kind of take over after, the main fighting ends. And that means it's effectively going to be forced to reoccupy the Strip, even though that's certainly not what anyone wants. And that will inevitably create a lot of animosity among the population, even by Israel's own count. I think it's, recently has said it's estimated it's killed maybe 8,000 or 9,000 Hamas militants. Even if you take that at face value, Israel's own estimates, put the number of Hamas militants at far higher than that. I think most recently the estimate was about 30,000. So we're still talking about a lot of people that it ostensibly wants to kill or capture that are still around. So we're going to see an insurgency there. And then what we've forecast and what is tragically coming true is the risk of regional escalation is absolutely going to remain on the table. To be very clear, all the parties involved, despite rhetoric, despite the incidents we've seen for the past few weeks and months, it's been very calibrated. Nobody is looking to actually stoke a direct confrontation here. However, there are so many fragile tripwires that it means that this risk is going to stay on the table, whether or not people are actively trying to expand the conflict. That could happen in a number of ways. Obviously, we've seen the Houthis in Yemen and attacks in the Red Sea, most recently being one area of conflict. The northern border with Lebanon, I would argue, is the one we're really watching out for. And of course, we've already seen a little bit of that just in the past week with the suspected, I think all but certain Israeli attack, killing a Hamas leader there in Beirut. And I should also flag, Israel has made very clear that it intends to assassinate Hamas leaders no matter where they are. And so we can expect more of these attacks and more flashpoints. And the big kind of actor in the background is Iran itself. Despite its very bellicose rhetoric, it has very clearly not wanted to directly confront Israel. Notably, both sides have not explicitly blamed the other for or taken credit for the October 7th attacks. They are clearly trying to keep their conflict to a proxy conflict. But the longer conflict goes on in Gaza, the longer you have the risk of Israeli retaliation into Lebanon. That would really impact Iran's chief proxy, which is Hezbollah. And by the way, the Iranian nuclear issue is still in the background. The more the risk of escalation is going to be there.
Yeah, indeed. Well, thank you for that. I was interested about you mentioned about the rise of attacks potentially against oil and gas infrastructure in places like Saudi Arabia. I don't know if you could talk a little bit about that concern. It's in the report.
Yeah, so one thing that we're focused on as a major area of potential escalation, and one thing a lot of our clients are thinking through is what is the pathway to which Iran or its proxies resume attacking civilian infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure, critical infrastructure. And we've seen this happen previously, where Iran and its proxies have gone after energy targets, particularly in Saudi Arabia. And our concern right now is, okay, if Iran is trying, or its proxies are trying to kind of asymmetrically hit back at the West, going after targets for oil and gas infrastructure like major oil fields, processing facilities, export facilities, et cetera, is one way to do it. Now, so far, you've seen Saudi Arabia basically be at pains to not make itself a target for Iranian or proxy attacks. For instance, Saudi Arabia, at least publicly, has not even signed up to the U.S. Maritime Initiative in the Red Sea, basically trying to stay out of the proverbial line of sight of Iran and its proxies. And, despite the past few months of war, we haven't seen any notable attacks within Saudi Arabia against oil and gas infrastructure. So this is one way, though, that things could really quickly spiral, and there would also be an immediate effect on global oil prices because Saudi Arabia just being the linchpin of production in the region, and kind of the war premium, so to speak, on top of the uncertainty of the global market, would definitely see prices spike if you took offline for even just a number of days, one of these major facilities.
Yeah, that's quite a big concern. So definitely want to keep an eye on that one. Let's move to Asia Pacific. This is quite an interesting area because we've got the elections in Taiwan this year, haven't we?
Yeah, coming up. That's going to be one of our first elections. And obviously, this is also being watched intensely because of what it means for the China-Taiwan dynamic. I do want to be clear, one piece of perhaps good news, we still don't think that a Chinese invasion of Taiwan is likely in 2024. Having said that, there are a lot of things that can still go really, really wrong in the region that kind of inch us closer to that scenario later this decade when we think it would be much more likely. So, as you mentioned, the thing that we're immediately starting out watching for is the Taiwanese election. This is going to be taking place, I guess, next weekend, given when we're recording this right now, Chris. And, this is something that's going to see both the president and the legislator elected. And this is important because right now you have the DPP, the party in charge, that takes a comparatively more hawkish position on China, more pro-sovereignty. And if polling is right, its presidential candidate will win again, and that would keep the DPP in charge of the presidency, which is both important practically and also symbolically. Now, the legislature is a different matter. The DPP actually is probably not going to have a majority, which for Taiwan and its own policymaking and internal dynamics is important. But what we're really focused on is the China-Taiwan dynamic, and who holds the presidency of Taiwan will absolutely affect that. As I said, we're not forecasting any sort of Chinese invasion or anything approaching that if the DPP does win this election. But what we do expect is a ramping up of that strategy of military and economic coercion that we've seen for at least the past few years, where China will input more trade restrictions on Taiwan. You'll see, an uptick, as we've already seen the past few years, of military exercises, air incursions of its airspace, naval naval incursions of nearby seas. And all of these serve not only as kind of a coercive symbolic effect, but also they're practical ways for the Chinese to practice an eventual evasion or other form of kind of military aggression against Taiwan. And, I should flag that we think of Taiwan as one island, and it does have one main island, but that's not the only case. It does have one that's, for instance, much, much closer to Chinese territory and much farther from Taiwan, which, to be blunt, if China were to ever, try to attack it, would easily overcome the Taiwanese defenses there. So, when we're thinking about Taiwan and ways that this situation could escalate but not result in formal war, what China does with, this island, what it does maybe with sea cables around Taiwan, cyber attacks, constant, harassment of its airspace and naval territory. All these are on the table, and they matter beyond the region. Because obviously, a global, or China-Taiwan war would have massive global ramifications. Again, not what we're forecasting this year, but assuming that there is a DPP presidency again, and you have the continual ramping up of this coercive strategy, in later years, some sort of Chinese aggression becomes more likely, and that would have global economic, military, political ramifications that honestly pale compared to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, not least because it would be almost assured that the United States would get involved in some way.
Yeah, we definitely don't want that to happen. One other thing that stood out in the report to me was about the sort of the tech sector and how the US is trying to decouple its supply chain from China that could benefit other Southeast Asian kind of countries. I don't know if there's anything you could talk about with that.
Yeah, so, I guess we spoke about this a little bit at the beginning of the Biden administration's strategy vis-a-vis China has really been to try to throttle its tech sector via various restrictions on exports to the country, both from U.S. suppliers, but then also other global suppliers, talking chiefly in the semiconductor industry, but, beyond that. And so this is definitely something we expect to just kind of slowly expand, not only with more restrictions in areas that we've seen, but also a slow expansion into other high-tech areas in things like AI technologies, communications, et cetera. And, if you're thinking about how to throttle Chinese economic development, restricting some of these key technologies is a real pain point. And the Chinese economy has been able to overcome some of them, but there's some real gaps that it won't be able to fill if it loses access to some of these things. That, of course, is notable not only for China, but also for a lot of other countries, because it opens them up to potential Chinese retaliation if they join kind of this U.S.-led campaign. It also opens up a number of business opportunities and economic opportunities if companies, say, are now moving out of China and moving into other parts of Southeast and South Asia. Now, obviously, there are a lot of broader global economic developments that affect that, but this U.S.-led pressure campaign on Chinese high tech is only going to ramp up further in 2024.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Well, let's take a quick break and then we'll be right back. Well, let's move on to the Americas. And we've got obviously elections in Mexico and other things kind of going on there. So let's have a look at that area.
Yeah, so Mexico is another election that I think, despite it being our southern border here in the United States, most of us here and probably the rest of the world have not been paying too much attention to the election here. This is slightly, I would say, less significant from a policy standpoint because we do expect general policy continuity from the outgoing government. You're only allowed to serve one term as the Mexican president to the new one, given kind of what current polling indicates. But, the U.S.-Mexico dynamic in terms of border security and migration is really something that is going to occupy not only the attention of the Mexican election, but also the U.S. election. I mean, if we were to forecast what is going to be, for instance, a top issue in the U.S. race, it's already been seen. The border is absolutely going to be, a crucial topic of discussion and what's something that the Democrats are going to be under constant pressure from Republicans over kind of their alleged inability to handle the migration. Within Mexico, one of the main things that we're looking at, and this actually connects quite nicely back to our previous conversation, Chris, is Mexico as a destination for proverbial nearshoring, friendshoring. Mexico is really trying to take advantage of a lot of companies that are now either looking or fully moving out of China and other parts of Asia to move closer to the United States. And, it's had some successes here, but there are also some major challenges, including with its energy sector. The current president, AMLO, has had a somewhat controversial policy here. His predecessor, or his successor, who we expect to come from, kind of his handpicked successor, likely to shift some things here. So this is something that we're looking at very closely, because whether or not Mexico can really capitalize on this drive to become a destination for companies that are leaving China is a bit of an open question. We've seen some successes, but whether it can truly take advantage remains to be seen.
Yeah. Are there any thoughts on the situation kind of developing in Venezuela at the moment?
It's a great question, and that's also one of the tensions. Is we're limited in the things that we can address, and there are plenty of other topics that we left on the proverbial cutting room floor, so to speak, where we talked about them. We decided ultimately it wasn't going to be as significant. We wanted to focus on other things, but the situation in Venezuela is an important one, and so I can briefly address. We actually saw quite a bit of movement on this issue in the last weeks of 2023, with the kind of back and forth between the government of Nicolas Maduro and the opposition. The opposition, despite clearly having a lot of popular support, has really been neutered by Caracas. Security services have just clamped down on public unrest, really prevented the opposition from gaining traction. Venezuela, in theory, will have quote unquote elections this year. We don't expect them to be free and fair. We expect Nicolas Maduro's government to remain in power. As a major energy producer, as a major source of immigrants that are heading towards the United States, what happens in Venezuela matters, beyond the country. It also has a big impact, say, on security in Colombia. A lot of Colombian armed groups kind of have safe havens in Venezuelan territory. So there are a whole lot of ways in which Venezuela matters beyond the country. But the short answer is we don't expect there to be any sort of democratic revolution. Nicolas Maduro and his cronies will stay in power. The humanitarian and security tragedy there will definitely just continue.
Yeah. One last thing in the Americas before we move on. I noticed you mentioned in the report about Argentina expecting unrest, and it just flagged up to me because last time things got bad in Argentina, it led to the invasion of the Falklands. I was just wondering, should that be something to keep an eye out for?
I do feel confident in saying that the Falklands or the Malvinas, if I were to take the Argentine perspective, are not on the table for 2024. But we've already seen kind of some of what we expected just in the past few weeks since Libertarian President Javier Milei has taken office. He's made good on his pledges to radically try to change the economy. He's obviously facing some pushback both in the courts and in the legislature, but he's basically pulling all the levers that he has kind of promised so far. He hasn't gone as far as trying yet to de-dollarize the economy as he pledged, but in terms of deregulating it, removing subsidies, etc., he's firing on all cylinders at the moment. And so while there may be a long-term economic gain from that, the Argentine economy has been just kind of a tragedy for many years now. Inflation and unemployment are at record levels. It's, if you're trying to start or operate a business there, it's incredibly difficult with different exchange rates and export tariffs, et cetera. So there may be long-term gains. The problem is those won't be realized for some time. And in the near term, there's going to be more proverbial pain as these things get implemented. So, for instance, already we've seen a few, mass protests led by unions pushing back against these things. And so looking at 2024, this risk of social unrest is going to remain high. We're going to see a lot more policy back and forth as Milei battles with the courts and the legislature to try to get his reforms implemented. And while, they may end up creating a better economic situation, he's going to be under constant political pressure and the constant threat of social unrest through the course of the year. Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for that. A bit close to home for me then. Let's talk a little bit about what's going to be happening in Europe. It's, again, quite a few things going on this year.
Yeah, and it's part of this is headlined by the fact that we are going to have parliamentary elections midway through the year, and believe it or not, the European Parliament does in fact matter. Especially as we've seen in quite a few countries, not all, but quite a few, a bit of a rightward shift in recent elections. So the expectation that right-wing parties will do comparatively better is definitely something we're looking at. What that means for things like the energy transition, for support for Ukraine, et cetera, all things to bear in mind. But there are, a couple of, key countries, obviously, we're always looking at thinking through within the European Union, obviously the chief powers, Germany, France. Our basic outlook here is a lot of policy gridlock. You have the Scholz government in Germany that's, leading this very precarious so-called traffic light coalition of three main parties. It's under significant pressure. It's struggling to implement its policies. We're not foreseeing an early election just yet, because basically all the parties know that if there were to be one, they would probably lose. So it's not in their interest, but it's going to really slow down policymaking in Germany. And then similarly in France, you have a parliament that's continuing to push back against President Macron. And, we even just saw a few weeks ago with this debate over an immigration bill there, that the political stability in France is definitely under threat as you have kind of a divided legislative and executive branch. And that's just going to make kind of getting anything done very, very hard for Macron and the rest of the government.
Yeah. And I think also you mentioned in the report, there's an unease in Europe about the American elections that are coming up and this potential, whether this will come up in the elections, I'm not sure, but this potential desire to sort of become more independent from American support. If there was anything on there you wanted to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. And this might be one, if you can call it a positive for Macron, who's really led the European champion to be quote unquote strategic autonomy, which means a lot of things to different people. But, yes. in blunt terms, I think basically refers to the idea Europe needs to be able to support itself more on its own and less dependent on America for chiefly military, but also economic support. And so, if you have growing unease in Europe of another Trump presidency, and we know that what that will mean for kind of alliance and partner structures, a significant decrease in them, this is a potential gain for Macron as he's been really the one championing this policy. So we do expect there to be more noises about this in 2024, especially as the election in the United States nears. And, if Trump does in fact win, you can expect that our 2025 forecast will have quite a lot to say on what this means for countries in Europe that have been the traditional, alliance partners for the United States.
Yeah, indeed. Well, before we move on to Eurasia, I'd be remiss to not mention the UK because we've got elections coming up this year, and I was just intrigued by what the report was saying about that, and I'll let you talk to us a bit about that. Yeah,
I mean, Chris, maybe we should have you write our forecast as our man on the ground. I think it's safe to say that the Conservative Party is under siege all over, both within the party, massive splits, but also then obviously it's polling tremendously behind the opposition Labour Party. And so if you believe the polls, it's kind of just a matter of how badly the Conservatives will lose the election. We're not in the business of necessarily calling elections, but we are in the business of forecasting what will happen if a different party wins or if there's, policy continuity between governments. And so up into the election, you can expect the Conservatives to try to do a number of kind of, populist handouts, try to drum up some support. But there's going to be this inevitable tension between a more kind of extreme right part of the party and proverbially more centrist rightist, if that makes sense. And Prime Minister Sunak really faces a really challenging balancing act here because on the one hand, he needs the support of the right wing of this party to basically do anything. But at the other hand, if he kind of gives into them, so to speak, and takes increasingly right-wing positions, that alienates him with a number of voters and makes the labor case even easier. So, I know I think just yesterday, we're recording this on Friday, Sunak basically intimated that the second half of the year was likely to be an election rather than the first half. So I suppose he's gambling that maybe the Conservatives can make up a little bit of ground in the first few months and at least not lose as badly. But the Tories are certainly in a tough spot.
Yeah, they are. I'm just my fear is it reminds me a little bit of 2015. There was a similar situation with the polls where it felt like that the Conservatives were definitely going to go after their first term. And then obviously they didn't. So it's really difficult to say what's going to happen in British politics because so many things could happen and affect things. But there definitely is a sense of changes coming. But yeah, sorry.
One positive thing that, I think we can say, Chris, is that the rapprochement between London and Brussels is, another positive sign for 2024. Obviously in the wake of Brexit, we've now a number of years out and there's still unresolved issues. But under, Sunak's government, we've seen, increasingly positive relations between UK and Europe. But this is another one of those issues where intra-party disputes within the Conservatives are a challenge because you obviously have still a right-wing faction that wants nothing to do with the European Union. But progress that we've seen in things on chiefly like the Northern Ireland Protocol, et cetera, have at least suggested that you're going to see at least a closer relationship, even if there's still a number of disputes. There's, some unpleasant rhetoric. We're not seeing this sort of massive divergence between the UK and the EU that could have been the truly worst case scenario.
Yeah, indeed. Well, let's move on to Eurasia, because we've obviously got the continuing war for Ukraine, and as we mentioned earlier, the Russian elections.
The Russian elections, I think we can safely say, as I mentioned earlier, are not exactly going to be elections, but more of another coronation. Expect Putin to remain in power. The only thing I would say that's really notable for the domestic situation in Russia is still in the context of the Ukraine war, what we expect from mobilization. Putin's really been at pains to not portray this as a formal war, still referring to it as a special military operation, trying to keep a semblance of normalcy. But the more Russia prepares for a long-term conflict, even if it's one of attrition that it, is succeeding in, the more the economy, the society needs to be put on that war footing, and the harder it is to kind of pretend that this isn't an actual war. And so he's going to continue to basically, we expect, certainly before the election, no major mobilization, nothing full. There's a, greater likelihood, at least comparatively, that later in the year you could see some more mobilization. But our basic forecast is we still expect Putin to try to avoid anything resembling a formal, official-looking draft and more rely on kind of ad hoc means. So, even earlier this week, we saw him sign a decree basically saying that if you fight for the Russian army or, crucially, Russian paramilitary forces, you and your families can become Russian citizens. So basically, giving, for instance, foreigners the opportunity, if anyone would really like that, I'm not sure why, to become a Russian citizen and fight that way. Going to say more convict mobilization, taking people from prisons, those type of things. But we don't expect that there's going to be, certainly not before the election, any sort of formal mobilization again, even though Russia definitely still needs more manpower in Ukraine.
Well, what does the report talk about with Ukraine? What do we think the outcome will be for this year? Yeah,
so this is, something that has definitely changed significantly in our thinking from 2023 to 2024. 2023, our forecast was that Ukraine would struggle to make significant gains in this counteroffensive, which is what came true, but there was a lot more momentum behind the Ukrainian cause. This year, I would say the script is flipped in that Ukraine is definitely now much more on the defensive. I mean, thinking ahead towards, as we spoke about at the beginning, the kind of falling Western support, or at least delayed Western support, that's a trend that's only going to accelerate over the course of the year. And Ukraine fundamentally is still, heavily reliant on the West for military and economic assistance. And so, our basic expectation is this is now kind of a more defensive battle. We don't expect any major territorial changes. Obviously, there will be smaller offensive. You've seen even just in recent days, Russia appearing like it, for instance, it could make some moves around Kharkiv in Ukraine. But fundamentally, the defensive lines are now incredibly well dug in. Both sides are kind of hoping that the U.S. election in the fall and other European polls, result in governments that are either more pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. And so fundamentally, we see this really as a stalemate in 2024. Our forecast for 2025, though, will be significant based on the outcome of what we see in a lot of these elections. Because, for instance, if the Trump administration returns to the White House, you get more right-wing governments in a number of European countries. That's going to really give Vladimir Putin a nice birthday present and really put Ukraine on the defensive. And so that would open up 2025 to be a different story. But for now, it's much more one of kind of a wait and see stalemate as we see it.
Yeah, thank you for that. Let's take a look at South Asia. What should we expect in that region?
Yeah, so this is probably the one, Chris, that actually, I might say, interests me on a personal level the most because you have a huge amount of elections here, not least in the world's largest democracy, India, that actually is so large that it takes multiple weeks to complete. But even just this coming weekend, you're going to see really crucial polls in Bangladesh. We're also going to see contested elections in Pakistan. Sri Lanka will see local votes. So you've got a huge chunk of the region voting. And this is an area of the world where you see a huge amount of competition between China and the United States for influence. You also see a lot of attempts by Russia to remain relevant, and particularly with its key partners, kind of that it's had for its oil sales and military sales in, say, Pakistan and India. But fundamentally, if you're looking at the key countries here, it's obviously India. We're not in the business of calling an election, but if you believe the polls, the most likely scenario is Narendra Modi's BJP party will win re-election. They've seemed on the whole largely unstoppable. The opposition Congress Party faces a huge number of challenges, not least of which is that it can't really seem to galvanize people in the way it used to, and it's really been circumscribed and some political abilities to really implement any significant policies in the few areas that it does control in the country. So, we're expecting, a lot of kind of policy continuity from the Modi government, assuming it's reelected, which is a kind of proverbial positive and negative thing, depending on how you look at certain issues. So, on the one hand, you're likely to see a lot more kind of Hindu nationalist rhetoric, which is obviously a concern, not just for India, but for the world. If you have a government that's increasingly marginalizing, or at least being alleged to marginalize, say, the massive Muslim minority that it has, that means there's real risks of violent unrest surrounding the polls, more contentious issues. On the other hand, you're also likely to see a lot more efforts by another Modi government to continue with economic development, things like the Made in India plan, which is again like Mexico, like other countries, trying to take advantage of companies that are looking for new places to make goods, and India trying to establish itself as that center. It faces a number of stumbling blocks, not least of which is red tape that the Modi government has been trying to slash, but there's just a lot to do. And so those are some of the things that we'll be looking at in India over the course of 2024.
Yeah. And there's also an election in Pakistan happening this year as well, isn't there? Is there anything you mentioned about that?
Yes. I mean, this is a huge back and forth here. Elections in Pakistan are sadly always, thought of as important because of the risk of violence. And this is tragically, confirming that trend. But, the Pakistanis have really had a kind of a miserable trifecta of political, economic, and security crises all going on at the same time. And so against that backdrop, you have an election that is theoretically supposed to be held at the beginning of February. We'll see if that perhaps gets delayed, which would be its own issue. And a lot of this is centered around former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who is, forced out of office and has basically been trying to lead a popular opposition movement since then. He's really been clamped down upon by the Pakistani government and its backers in the military. But whether or not he's able to sufficiently galvanize enough people at the polls next month will be a key thing to watch. And even if he doesn't succeed, if he's able to frame himself as kind of the victim and allege improprieties, you have a really combustible situation, unfortunately, in Pakistan. And I don't even, mean to elevate, everybody always talks about Pakistan. It's a nuclear armed country. We don't even need to go there. We don't need to involve nuclear weapons. It's combustible already on its own, just by the power cuts, the militant attacks that's been facing, the massive political instability. So this is another thing to watch. And obviously, what happens in Pakistan has huge ramifications beyond just the region, given the weight that it holds.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. We managed to get through all the regions, so thank you so much for that. I did have one last question. Because this year is kind of the year of elections, I wondered whether or not this might be the year of an increased risk of low-level terrorism, especially in Europe, because usually when there are elections, there are kind of like political groups and terrorist groups who like to try and sort of take advantage of that. And I don't know whether there was anything mentioned in your offices about that kind of topic there.
Yes, in fact, our other more tactical security forecast that we didn't focus on today does include this quite a bit. And our basic expectation is, yes, across the board, the terrorist threat to the West is going to increase in 2024, driven not only by a number of elections, but by fallout from the Gaza conflict, of course. And I should also be clear here, we're not just talking about Islamist extremism, but also far-right extremism, a whole disparate set of extremist ideologies here. So not only do you have elections and the fallout from Gaza, but I should also point out you have a number of high-profile other events, like, for instance, the Olympics in Paris. Even for weeks now, the French security forces have been almost weekly coming out with new updates on what they're planning to do to try to prevent attacks. And so, when we're thinking about the terrorist threat to the West, since, I would say approximately 2018 or so, when ISIS really lost its last major territory in Iraq and Syria, the threat has mainly been from lone actors, small groups of individuals in the West, kind of inspired by some of these foreign terrorist groups. We have thankfully, and I'll knock wood on my desk here, not seen any sort of a replication of the major directed attacks that we saw earlier in the 2010s. For instance, obviously the most tragic ones being in Paris, but in a number of other countries in the West. And so what we're seeing here still, if you're thinking from a security services point of view, on the one hand, when you're dealing with lone actors and small cells, they can, in general, do less damage than a kind of coordinated, directed terrorist attack. When you only have one or two people, just the amount of violence you can cause is comparatively limited. The challenge is it's much harder to identify those people in advance. So that's why you see kind of these lower level sophistication attacks, whether it's a stabbing that's horrific on its own, but compared to what a foreign directed attack could do, thankfully less intense. The flip side of this is that terrorist groups, whether it's ISIS, Al-Qaeda, etc., have been under significant counterterrorism pressure abroad, but that doesn't mean they've stopped plotting. I mean, obviously, we saw just earlier this week, ISIS claimed these twin bombings in Iran, showing that it really can still cause a lot of damage, and it has strong intent to go after minority groups in the West. And so, the pace of plotting and aspirational goals of these groups absolutely remains. And so, when you're thinking through ways that 2024 could differ, we assess that in general, the threat of some of these foreign groups being able to successfully conduct a mass casualty attack while still very constrained, it has increased a bit in likelihood, just given the global events that you talked about, whether it's elections, these other high-profile developments, the fallout from the Gaza war, in which Islamist extremists in particular are absolutely looking to take advantage of that. And so I would say yes, in general, the terrorism threat has increased, and while these foreign groups still face a lot of constraints on their ability to mount an attack, we definitely are concerned that there is at least this year a little more of an opening that they might be able to do something.
Yeah. One to definitely keep an eye on. Well, thank you very much for all that. Sam, is there anything else about anything that we've talked about today that's important to you you'd like to add at all?
Oh boy, well, I think we did a pretty good job, Chris, going over the entire globe. Yeah. There's a lot of different things we didn't get a chance to touch on, but I guess maybe I'll say that for anyone that's interested, you can obviously read our work at ranenetwork.com. We publish 3 more quarterly updates, so you'll be able to see the trends that we got right right. Hopefully very few things that we got wrong. And otherwise, I just really appreciate you having me on and taking the time to chart out what we think 2024 will look like.
Yeah, well, no, thank you for your time. I will just add, I think the report is beautifully presented. There's some great maps and infographics on there, and it's definitely very much worth people pursuing and finding out more about if they can. So, thank you for sharing it with me, and thank you for your time today. So, Sam, you take care, and I look forward to catching you again in the near future.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.